There are many mysteries surrounding the early Scottish witch hunts and what led to their inception. The common explanation was an ever more fanatical Christian presence, demanding that we sever all links with our culture and history. Were these so-called covens of witches actually just the remnants of the old Scottish shamanic traditions, being smuggled through time as these obscure nature cults, still believing that true power and knowledge came from the land and was controlled, of course, by the Daoiné? Perhaps the origins were far less spiritual, and the witch-hunting hysteria was simply the newest iteration of the classic class struggle, with an intensely misogynistic and sexist core. The vast majority of people convicted and affected by the witch hunts were the working class and the poor. Specifically, elderly women were the most likely to be accused, condemned, and killed for witchcraft. Were they targeted for their beliefs, or as a scapegoat to unite the populace in the hysteria that was the king's will, and aid the church and government in subduing a current ideological shift? Of course, it's entirely possible that all are true to varying extents. But behind it all, who truly were these accused women? Were they evildoers in league with the devil, casting spells and enchantments on their innocent neighbours? Or healers, herbalists, and community leaders? Perhaps we can get a little more insight on the matter as we look at one of the most documented early witch trials in Scottish history, Janet Bowman. Janet Bowman was an elderly woman living in Cowgate, Edinburgh, who was arrested in 1570 for the crimes of sorcery, witchcraft, charming, and associations with fairies. What follows is all the information I could find in Janet's life up until her arrest. Now, it is believed that Miss Bowman was born in Ayrshire to unknown parents, and would live there through much of her adolescence. It is also here that she would meet and marry her husband, a man by the name of William Steele. As a quick side note, during this time in Scottish history, women did not take their husband's surname as they did in England, and that would not become common practice here until far later. It would seem that names in Scotland have always held great value and importance for the people. Janet and her husband would eventually move to Cowgate in Edinburgh, so that they could both look for work. But when the woman first arrived in the city, she had become afflicted with an unspecified illness, and was seeking the aid of a local healer. The woman she found was one Maggie Denham of Potterrow. Now, it was said that Maggie formed an instant bond with Janet, and was determined to cure her illness before taking her as an apprentice. Maggie told the ill woman to meet her that very evening at a little-known spring on the southern side of Arthur's Seat, the extinct volcano that towers over the city of Edinburgh. During this point in Scottish history, holy wells and healing springs had gained great popularity. The most current school of thought was of a Christian-centric view, where the water at these springs and wells were blessed by a member of the church, or appeared as some form of miracle or gift granted by God. This gave rise to hundreds of holy wells scattered all throughout Scotland, and each being found by, or named for, a local saint. Although there was another, far older viewpoint, which had its roots in the ancient animism of Celtic beliefs, where the restorative nature of the springs were the work of powerful water spirits, each controlled or linked to the Daoiné, or folk of Elfheim. Now, some springs were said to be guarded by malicious or dark spirits tasked with warding off intruders, while others were happily shared with mortal folk, commonly as recompense for some form of offering. These she-wells, or springs, were often seen as areas linked directly to Elfheim, or the world beneath the mounds. It was believed by many at the time that these points could act as a gateway between the worlds for both mortal and she alike. But returning to Janet and Maggie, They would both meet that very evening by the enchanted spring on the south side of Arthur's Seat. There Janet was guided to the water's edge, and Maggie began a strange ritual comprising of song and dance. While the elder woman revelled in her performance, a great roaring and crashing began to emit from the very ground itself. For a brief moment, Janet believed the mountainous seat of Arthur had returned to life. But before she could make her mind up, several radiant beings appeared on the opposite side of the water, each clad in long green robes adorned with gold and silver. The summoned spirits invited both Janet and Maggie to follow them into the other world, where Janet claimed to have spent 7 long years living with the Sidhe in Elfheim. There she not only learned of the healing arts and gained the second sight, but would also give birth to 7 half-Sidhe sons and daughters, cementing her relationship and loyalties with the old gods. When Janet finally left the healing home of the otherworld, she found that those 7 years had passed for her. In our world, only some hours had gone by, and she found herself by Arthur's Seat the morning after she had went to the spring. Soon she would return home, completely cured of her illness, and that very day began her life as a healer. With the help and guidance of Maggie, Janet's knowledge of herbology, medicine, prophecy, and summoning only increased. And as the years passed, unfortunately, so did Maggie, leaving Janet Bowman to become the most sought-after wise woman in Edinburgh, with all of her most notable practices relating in some way back to the very healing spring or eldritch well where she herself was cured. Janet would go on to specialise in the production of healing tonics produced from various herbs mixed with the enchanted waters of the Elven Well. She was accredited with the ability to heal many diverse sicknesses, and most commonly those found in young children. In a recorded statement from the time, we hear of a more unusual cure that the healer would implement on special occasions. It was told that Janet had been asked to aid one William Craig, a man who was suffering greatly from some unknown illness. Janet told the family that she would need the man's shirt, and with that she could determine not only his illness, but also if she possessed the skill to treat him. That evening, the old healer took the man's shirt out to the eldritch well near Arthur's Seat, and through a series of chants called upon the Sidhe for assistance. In her own testimony, collected later at the trial, Janet tells of this case and of how her summoning ritual caused a great ferocious wind which tore at the surrounding earth before it suddenly vanished, revealing a tall, radiant man standing next to the spring. She would petition the spirit in the name of Arthur and Queen Elsbeth that he grant her knowledge of the man's sickness and of a possible cure. The enchanting figure fully complied with the woman's request and told her to wash the man's shirt in the south-running water, before returning it still wet to its owner and telling the man to wear the shirt for the next 9 days. Now this is precisely what Janet did, and soon the ill man was clad in a cold, damp shirt. The healer told him that in 9 days he would either cease to live or be completely cured. Now as the days passed, Mr. Craig gained more strength, and by the 9th day he was entirely restored to his previous state. Both he and his wife were extremely grateful to Janet for the work she had done and for the danger inherent in it. It would seem that Janet only used this ritual on very rare cases, specifically for illnesses that could not be tamed with tonics or herbs. Any interaction with the Sidhe could be dangerous for all involved, and this can be seen quite clearly in the testimony of a local blacksmith. This man, one Alan Lauderston, had been gravely ill for some time, and no matter what medicines he tried, none would restore his strength. Knowing of Janet Bowman and the stories and rumours that surrounded her, Lauderston sent his wife on his behalf to ask Janet for aid. Soon the healer was by the man's bedside, and just as she had done before, Janet took the man's shirt and headed off towards the spring by Arthur's Seat. Once again, the Sidhe were summoned to the healer's aid, and once more the shirt was to be washed in the south-running water. Janet eventually returned to the man's wife and told her to dress her husband in the shirt and to leave it upon him for 9 days. But as the smith's wife returned to her ever-sickening husband, she was worried that the cold and wet shirt would only worsen his condition, so ignoring Janet's instructions, she would first hang it out to dry, thinking that it could cause no harm. But that night, as the blacksmith's family slept, their home was buffeted by a powerful wind. Doors and windows began to blow open and slam closed, and the unmistakable whisper of strange voices could be heard in the air. The couple cowered in horror as an ear-shattering clang began to ring out from the anvil in the man's workshop. The pair would hold each other close and wait out the terrible storm. As the first light of morning appeared, the winds died and the whispers vanished. The wife would run to the healer's house and beg her aid with the terrible haunting. But Janet already knew exactly why the winds had came and chastised the wife for not following the instructions that were given to her. When aid is demanded of the Daoiné, it should be carried out exactly to their specifications, or you will bring their wrath upon you. Janet told the woman she would try again, but this time the wife was to do exactly as she was told. For the second time, the healer took the smith's shirt and washed it in the south-running water, before returning it to the man's wife with the same set of instructions as before. Yet it would seem that this ritual may have been doomed to failure from the very start, as even though the wife did exactly as she was told by Janet, that evening her husband would tear off the cold shirt while trapped in his ever-maddening fever. Later that night, the angered spirits would appear again, but this time windows would shatter and doors would be blown clean from their hinges, and throughout all of this chaos, the heart-stopping pounding of hammer on anvil could be heard constantly. After surviving a second traumatic night, tormented by the Sidhe, the wife once again ran to the healers, but this time Janet was not to be found. She had been called away to help another, and would not return for some time. Days would pass, and eventually Janet would return on the very afternoon of Samhain. The smith's tormented wife begged Janet to help them once more, or at the very least to banish or appease the spirits that now haunted them. But the old healer would have to decline. She told the wife of how the spirits are most active on the night of Samhain, of how they leave their realm to dance and celebrate in our world, meaning that today the Sidhe were at rest and could not be summoned or called upon by anyone. Dejected, the wife returned home, and on that very night, the crippling fever would take the life of Mr. Lauderston. This shows the complexities and the danger involved in summoning the Sidhe, and why they were only ever used by Janet as a last resort. Now, not only was Janet particularly knowledgeable in the field of healing, but she also possessed the ancient power of second sight, and with such could divine or prophesize many futures. This is seen in a strange record where there is evidence that Janet Bowman was consulted during a conspiracy to kill the then ruling regent, James Stuart, the first Earl of Murray. On one day, Janet was called to attend some local noblemen, one Sir William Stuart, Lord Lion, King of Arms, and Archibald Napier, 9th Laird of Merchiston. Now the pair never divulged to the woman their terrible plan, and would only require of her to divine an answer to 3 specific questions. Firstly, they asked the whereabouts of the Queen on the first Sunday in May, to which Janet answered that the Queen would be at Lochleven that day. The second question concerned Sir William's standing with the Queen, to which Janet replied that he was currently in a very good standing with the Queen. And lastly, would Mary Queen of Scots return to the Scottish throne? To this the healer told them that not only would the Queen return, but she would marry Stuart and bear him children. With the questions asked and the answers gladfully received, the woman was paid and granted leave of the house, returning to Cowgate. Interestingly enough, the prophecies or divined answers given by Janet were all true in some fashion. Mary Queen of Scots was held in Lochleven Castle for some time, and was said to have only escaped on the 2nd of May, so it's very possible that she was there on that coming Sunday. Now William, Lord Lion, King of Arms, had always been in good standing with the royal family, at least up until the discovery of his devious conspiracy, so this answer was perhaps the least surprising. And for the third question, Mary Queen of Scots would indeed return to Scotland and marry a man with the surname of Stuart, just not William Stuart. But it would seem that all these questions were rather pointless in the end anyway, as the pair's conspiracy was quickly unravelled, and soon they were both arrested and charged with conspiring to kill the Scottish regent by sorcery and necromancy, for which William Stuart himself was burned at the stake in St Andrews on the 16th of August 1569. Fortunately, Janet was not mentioned during the pair's trial, which mostly centred on their previous dealings with a Norwegian witch. Yet it was not long after the burning of Sir William that the healer herself would face the court. In 1570, Janet was arrested and charged with sorcery, witchcraft, charming, and association with fairies. But before the old healer could be imprisoned, she and her husband escaped the city and returned to Ayrshire, where she remained at liberty, continuing to help those who required her aid until her eventual recapture in 1572, when her trial would finally commence. Janet Bowman was condemned by the court for her conversation, speech, and familiarity with the fair folk, whom the prosecutor named as demons or spirits of the devil, although it is perhaps worth noting that neither the devil nor his demons were ever mentioned by Janet or any of her accusers. The court eventually found that her crime was a crime against God, as she had drawn the hearts of many locals away from the sanctity of Christ. Due to this, she was pronounced guilty of all charges and burned to death on the 29th of December, 1572. There is no evidence that Janet Bowman caused any harm to anyone, and whether her dealings with the Sidhe be true or not, this woman was undoubtedly a healer with much knowledge of the medicinal properties of plants, which of course have been used all over the world for thousands of years, often when so-called spiritual healing completely fails. All the available testimonies suggest that she was a kind, generous person whose old remedies seemed to have beneficial effects on many in the local populace. For such a person to be taken from their home and burned alive for the knowledge and wisdom they contained is, in my opinion, inhuman and a constant blight on Scottish history. Let us all hope that we have learned and continue to learn from these mistakes in our past, as we move hopefully into a brighter future. Thank you for listening, and a special thank you to all my wonderful patrons who help me keep these tales alive. One part of Janet's life that is never focused on seems to be her religious beliefs, which I think may have contributed to her eventual death. Janet in many ways still practiced the old beliefs, giving offerings to the spirits and revering the powers of nature. But the old healer would also include various Christian saints and beliefs in her daily life. It would seem that she had a pretty open mind when it came to the supernatural and divine. She would gladly take part in many Christian ceremonies, which themselves were based on the older pagan ceremonies that gave thanks to the Sidhe or the old gods. But one thing we know for sure was that Janet was classed as a reclusiant. Now at that time, the Elizabethan religious settlement had been introduced to Scotland, which created a book of common prayers and obliged everyone to attend church on a Sunday and on holidays. Those who refused to appear in church were known as reclusiants. Now this was commonly applied to Catholics who refused to attend the new Reformed Church, but it also incorporated any other beliefs or reasons for not attending. The reclusiants were subjected to punishments such as fines, property confiscation, imprisonments, and on rare occasions, death. Not to mention that they were commonly seen as social pariahs, and I wonder if it was due to Janet's reclusiant nature that superstition and rumours began to flow all around her. We're not sure how or why her name was first mentioned in the judicial system, but perhaps her absence from the church triggered an initial interest in Janet, and the accusations of witchcraft came later. From what I have found, it may actually be true that Janet swayed some people away from the church. There are a few mentions of the healer attempting to save the lives of sick children, before unfortunately failing. Janet would commonly tell grieving parents that their child was safe and healthy in Elfhame, and that her ability to travel between the realms meant she could deliver messages and care for the children who had been left in that land. Whether Janet truly believed this or not, we don't know, but it did provide some comfort to the grieving parents, and may have influenced their belief in the Sidhe. One specific treatment is mentioned a few times in multiple accounts of Janet Bowman, and that is a tonic made from spring water and woodbine or honeysuckle. This tonic was used by the old healer to cure infants of various medical conditions. This tonic's curative abilities are very possible, as in our modern day there's a lot of scientific evidence showing the medical effects of the honeysuckle plant when ingested. It acts as an anti-inflammatory and also has many antiviral properties. So it seemed that the wise woman, and in particular old Maggie Denham, knew far more than most give them credit for. The case of Janet Bowman is particularly interesting as it occurs very early in the period of Scottish witch hysteria, and as such seems to lack many of the later traits of the witch hunts. Specifically, it is mentioned that Janet was not ill-treated during her imprisonment, and that torture was not required to extract a confession, a practice that along with witch pickers would become far more common later. This case also lacked the wild descriptions of meetings with the devil and of demonic orgies with brutal human sacrifice, all of which seems to be more of a product of the later witch hunters rather than the so-called witches themselves. Interestingly, just before the time of the Scottish witch hunts was a period of advancement for women who had begun taking more powerful positions in the community, including the church and even in education. It was during this surge forward in women's rights that a great backlash came from the powers that be, initially removing the legal status of women, meaning that they could not be relied upon as witnesses and were not legally responsible for their own actions, something that was left entirely to their fathers or husbands. There was also increased punishments for infanticide, which would commonly penalise miscarriages and unexplained deaths. Many current historians now believe that the increasing advancement of women led the church and the government to increase their attempts to control and constrain them, which may have been one of the wide variety of factors that would eventually lead to one of the most historic atrocities in Scottish history. Until next time, Slán Живá.